an institutional point of view. Now, what about from a normative point of view? And of course, the fact that this ambiguity is at work and is aligned when it comes to the institutions, the norms, and the operations, the actions, makes total sense, right? So, once again, to go back to this idea of tension, from a normative standpoint, on the one hand, you clearly have a very significant normative and legal commitment of the UN and of the legal instruments produced by the UN, strong commitment to key democratic values and principles, and this is illustrated in the field of human rights, which is both in terms of war and in terms of peace, and the importance of development when it comes to the UN. So this is illustrated in the field of human rights, more specifically through the adoption of all these international treaties which have been adopted since the 1950s, once again both in times of peace and in times of war, and in general it's also illustrated by the strong commitment of the UN to the idea of rule of law, once again within nations, among nations. So this is, if you will, the happy picture from a normative standpoint, if you will, of the UN commitment to democracy. But once again, this is balanced from a normative point of view and let me just, before moving to the other end, indicate that this happy, positive picture when it comes to the commitment of the UN to human rights and democracy, this evolution, this commitment is illustrated and has enabled, if you will, the move from absolute sovereignty, which is, if you will, the nature of the Westphalian world, to conditional sovereignty, that is to say, the ability for member states to enjoy sovereignty based on their own ability to fulfill their commitment towards what they owe to individuals, what they owe to their citizens, what they owe to their fellow member states in the context of the international system. And so the evolution of moving from absolute sovereignty to conditional sovereignty is in a way an illustration of the seriousness accompanied by historical evolutions of the UN commitment to democratic ideals and ideals. And once again, it is in this context that in the past 20 years, all the debates and discussions and commitment concerning humanitarian interventions, human security, responsibility to protect have taken place, right? In a way, you see the way we have been putting these three notions and these three sets of policies, humanitarian interventions, human security, responsibility to protect, on the map, is an illustration of this move towards conditional sovereignty, which itself is an illustration of becoming more democratic of the domestic and international landscapes under the influence of this commitment from the UN to democratic ideals. So, on the other hand, this is my on the other hand, the fact of the matter is that these norms dedicated to rule of law never override, in fact never dislodge, if you will, the fact that international distribution of power based on lack of parity among powers wins the day. And this is illustrated as well as demonstrated by the fact that again and again, even in terms of crisis, but also in terms of negotiations of treaty, of protocols, and so on. We see this, for instance, in the context of the debate concerning climate change. The national interest of member states, and of course primarily the national interest of powerful states, which are supposed to be the underwriter of this system, always wins or overrides the international interest, which would be, member states coming together. And in an analog fashion, self-defense is always more priority for member states than collective security, simply because, in fact, member states don't take collective security seriously, or they only take collective security seriously when it is the collective security, when it is the security of other countries which is at stake, and which is meant to be, handled by collective security, but it is when it is their own self-security or self-defense, well, be sure that they never really put much trust in collective security. Okay, so all this to tell you that even though there is a normative commitment to democratic-related norms and values, the fact of the matter is that real politics, or the politics of power, takes the lead in the context of UN politics. And in fact, this leads to the fact that when it comes to being committed to human rights as part and parcel of the democratic creed, the fact of the matter is that there are moral obligation at the international level, but there are no legal obligations to look after people beyond borders in the UN context. And this is illustrated by the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. The Convention, of course, stipulates that genocide has to be prevented, but it certainly doesn't, one, indicate how it should be done, and when it has the possibility to choose between a passive attitude of prevention and an active attitude of prevention, well, it chooses the passive attitude of prevention. And this is an indication that even though there is the wish expressed that genocide has to be prevented, has to be stopped, there is no obligation for this to happen. And in fact, the nature of all the international treaties in the field of rights of individuals and human rights, be it for social rights, economic rights, cultural rights, human rights, and so on, none of them really talk about legal obligations. They talk about the need to protect, but I mean, in my view, legal obligations also calls for sanctions if protection doesn't happen. And yet, when it comes to all of these treaties, there is never the idea that if member states do not really take action to enforce this protection of rights, there will be sanctioned. So the fact that there is no idea of sanctioning the member states not delivering on this commitment to rights is an indication that the most we have is moral obligation, and we certainly don't have legal obligations when it comes to rights protection. And in a way, one could argue that the value of the responsibility to protect, which is a notion which emerged in the late 1990s and was formalized and officialized by the UN in 2005 in the context of the World Summit, is very much an illustration of the state of affairs. Because the responsibility to protect is on the one hand, recognizing that most of the treaties we have in the field of rights protection do not really put forward an obligation to protect. At most, they talk about a moral obligation, and of course, such moral obligation is not good enough. Hence, the idea of introducing this notion of responsibility, which is, if you will, an in-between or a bridge between no legal obligation and a moral obligation, which is in fact based on the willingness of member states. And very often, when the interest of these member states at stake, there is no way to be seen in terms of acting in defense of individuals. And so the responsibility to protect in all its positiveness, if you will, is itself the recognition of this very fact, no legal obligation in terms of protection of rights, at best moral obligation, which we cannot really trust, on which we cannot really rely. So this is what we can say about the normative ambiguity of the UN on the one hand, on the other hand. Now, what about testing and illustrating this ambiguity on the ground, if you will, from an operational standpoint? And of course, there are different ways of testing this ambiguity. One other way, besides this one, would be development. What is the true commitment of member states, including rich member states, to development? Then you will see, or you would see, that in fact this commitment in many ways is close to inexistent. But I mean, another way to to illustrate this ambiguity beyond, if you will, development and global poverty, is to think about what has been done in situations of crisis, of war, in the context of which civilians, more than anybody else, have been targeted. And here, in the past 20 years, we have two operational illustrations, if you will, of this ambiguity. Peacekeeping operations in the 90s, not international interventions, and international interventions in the 2000s. So let's begin quickly with the peacekeeping operations in the 90s. So once again, most of the conflicts in the 90s, which partly resulted from the unfreezing of geopolitical relationships between the West and the non-West, led to conflicts, to crises, in the context of which not only civilians were targets in times of war, but killing civilians was also used, or harming civilians was also used as a weapon of war. And of course, some of the worst crises of the period were Somalia, Bosnia, Kosovo, Rwanda, but many other crises in Eastern Africa, among other things. And in all these cases, and in different ways, in fact, you were led to witness that either the international community was willing to help, but within limits. That was the case in Somalia, that was the case in Bosnia, that was the case in Kosovo, in different ways, once again, or in the worst case scenario, was unwilling at all to act, so that Rwanda genocide would unfold unchallenged. So that's one way to illustrate, once again, if we assume that human rights are part of the democracy or democratic paradigm, this is one way to illustrate via peacekeeping operations in the 90s, because of course, democracy is about responsibility towards others, about solidarity, all these things, right? So this is one way to illustrate this ambiguous relationship that the UN has to democratic values in the context of peacekeeping operations, the context of crisis. And the argument could be put forward in similar terms when it comes to the crisis and discussed never happening possible interventions in the 2000s. Of course, something happened in Libya, but in a way it was a bit of an accident of drafting resolution. Somehow the way the resolution which led to NATO being involved in Libya was overlooked by the Russians and was overplayed by the US, France, and the UK. And in the end, an intervention or some involvement took place, but in very paradoxical fashion. And of course, in Syria, the killing continues, and nothing is being done to stop it. In a way, one could argue that the chemical weapons debate has been a way for the Western powers, including the US, to not really feature and display its lack of true commitment to stopping the killing. So this is what we can say very quickly in terms of illustrating once again commitment to human rights and exercise of responsibility and solidarity beyond borders, once again as a possible figure of the democratic paradigm and so on. Okay. So let me conclude, because I don't want to keep you too long. Where does it leave us for the way forward? And here there are three things that I think, and once again, I'm just going through these things quite quickly. There are three ways through which we can think about the way forward. In fact, these three ways forward are unfolding in one way or another today, not necessarily without much success. So one way to think about the way forward as a way to go beyond this ambiguity and perhaps push further the democratic side and reduce further resistance to the democratic side. So one way is reforming the institution, the second one is reforming the global system, and the third one thinking about what it is to be human and what it is to be human in a reconciled fashion. Okay, so once again, what about reforming institutions as a way to push further, as a way to press on this democratic agenda? Well, these things are being discussed. I mean, reforming the Security Council has been on the agenda for a number of years, and the idea is to make the Council more representative in terms of being more inclusive, but also more representative in terms of reflecting more than it is the case today, how the world has changed in the past 60 years, and among the candidates to become full permanent members of the Council, you have Japan here.
Yeah.
Okay. So and so I'm just checking if you are still with me or sleeping. I'm not testing your knowledge. I'm testing whether or not you are awake, right? And so, so when it comes to reforming the Council, well, you have in the African context Nigeria and South Africa in competition. In the Southeast Asian, in the Asian context, you have in Southeast Asia Pakistan and India. In the Northeast Asia context, you have Japan. And in the European context, I mean, some people say that as a way to be more reflective of the period, maybe we should, put the European Union as a replacement for the UK and France. But of course, since all this reform has to be endorsed by the beneficiaries of the present situation, that is to say the permanent members, it's very difficult to make it happen. And plus, the fact that you have competition among countries being eager to become permanent members, then it becomes a problem. In Africa, in fact, in the last, I think it was 6 or 7 years ago, that there was a real debate on the matter. The fact that both South Africa and Nigeria were candidates, and that the members of the African Union were not able to really decide which of these two countries should be the candidate, and ended up serving the status quo, right? And then the second type of reform put forward, or at least discussed about in the context of the UN, is creating a UN People Assembly, which would be truly representing people and not simply government, and which would have a true legislative power. And here, the work of Thomas Frank, who used to work for the UN for a number of years, and then joined NYU afterwards, and he passed away 2 years ago, I think, but he's a very, very important international public lawyer, has done a lot of work on the matter. So if you're interested in this issue. So this is what we have when it comes to reforming institutions as actors of the global system. Okay. Then what about the global system? Well, in place you have, among other things, two models. Of course, Coicaud doesn't count here. Coicaud should be here in parentheses. But among models, you have, I think, interestingly enough, Jürgen Habermas and David Held. And Jürgen Habermas is a German philosopher who is committed to the idea of rule of law in the constitutional context of Germany, as a way to move beyond Nazi Germany. And but he is also someone very committed to the European Union, and in fact he has done a lot of work on the possibility of conceptualizing and implementing what he calls world domestic policy. And in fact the work that I am doing on global policy owes much to this Habermasian idea of world domestic policy, and it's the idea of having at the global level not simply norms as it is the case today, but in fact mechanisms, actors, allocation of resources, including financial resources, which would allow to, if you will, domesticate international politics and make it possible for policy to become part of a reality at the global level. The other interesting model is the one put forward by David Held, who is a British political scientist who has done a lot of work on global democracy, trying to sort out what can be taken from domestic democracy and upgrade it at the global level as a way to see ways through which we would be able to democratize global relationships and create synergies and compatibilities between democracy at the national level and democracy at the international or global level. And then Coicaud, once again, should be in parentheses here. And I have been doing work in the past 2 or 3 years on the possibility of global policy. But to say what could be the path for moving beyond simply having the UN negotiating and adopting norms which are global, but never giving the international community the means to go from norms to policy at the global level. And so this is, and I tend to think that if we're going to be serious about development and the environment, it's not enough to think about global norms. We truly have to think and find a way to put forward this sense of global policy. So these are some of the models on the table, but of course the challenges for this to happen are enormous. One of them, which is not mentioned here, is an intellectual challenge. How do you think against the way, how do you learn to think, how do you imagine an intellectual path which would be foreign or against the one to which we are used now. So there is also an intellectual challenge. You know, we don't really have the intellectual tools to think about the future beyond who we are and what we have today. But beyond this intellectual challenge, I think that we also have a major issue when it comes to a crisis of political representation and participation, both at the national level and at the international level. I think that we more or less now all agree on the fact that both in developed and developing countries, the political class or the bureaucracy elite is lacking more and more credibility and legitimacy. So you have a crisis of political representation and participation, and in this condition, on the basis of this deep crisis at the national level, how do you go about solving a crisis of political representation and participation at the global level? This is complicated. And then you have also another challenge when it comes to the economic crisis, and I tend to think that the 2008 economic crisis was more was not a standalone event. It was more the provisional ending outcome of a trend, which is the one of modern capitalism, having partly to do with the financialization of the economy, the growing gap between the wealthy and the poor, and in the end, simply perhaps and massively, an issue of growth model as a way to generate social, political, and economic integration. So these are the challenges that one encounters when it comes to rethinking and remaking the world. So, what does it leave us? And this is the conclusion of my conclusion for the way forward, after the way forward. So I think that here, so we have to think about economic and political models that would, of course, generate more economic and political integration within nations and among nations. Easier said than done, needless to say. And I think that we also have to think beyond or move from global Western-centric models to wide, open, inclusive, and integrated global models. How do we make it happen? I don't know. How do we bring to the table the cosmopolitan dimension of non-Western models? I don't know. How do we integrate them to an hybrid model of the West and the non-West? I don't know, but these are things that we have to think about. I think it's not because we don't have the answers that we should